Hey there, Agile pencils that you thought maybe you lost forever, but then you started sweeping and you moved your couch and you were like, oh, there's where that pencil went. And welcome to another episode of Agile Bytes, the podcast sponsored by Integrity Inspired Solutions, where we build software in an agile manner day in and day out. I called this episode Limiting WIP Without WIP Limits, first of all, because I like clickbait titles, and apparently you do as well. But also because I couldn't think of a great way to phrase what this topic is actually about. So I'm going to start talking about it, and maybe you can tell me in the comments or an email or a message on LinkedIn or something what you think would have made a good title for this episode, because I'm not actually going to talk very much about WIP limits. Instead, I'm going to talk about a mechanism that you may or may not be paying attention to that will serve a very similar or at least complementary function. When I talk about WIP limits, in case you are new to the show or new to this topic in particular, WIP stands for work in process or work in progress, and it means the items that we've started, but they're not done yet. We're still working on them, right? They're in progress. We started them, but we haven't finished them yet. And a big principle of running lean and efficiently is we keep our WIP limited. We don't just keep starting stuff. We want to finish the things that we start. And if you think about most agile or lean strategies or frameworks, they usually have some way to try to do this. For example, in Scrum, they limit WIP by having a sprint goal and a time box. So you can't just do everything all at once that you've ever wanted to do. You have a specific goal, so you limit your work to the items that roll up under that goal, that accomplish that goal. But you're also limited by the time box. Okay, so what can I get done in a week or 2 weeks or however long your sprints are? That works because Scrum has kind of a start-stop model. You meet a goal, you stop, you retrospect, you review, you do it again and again. Kanban has a flow-based model, so limiting it by time box doesn't make a whole lot of sense. So instead, Kanban does it by declaring how many items you can have going at once and still be effective. Some teams will do this at each stage of the development process. So maybe you have a WIP limit for how many cards you can be getting requirements on, another limit for how many you can be coding on, another limit to how many you can be testing on, whatever. I encourage most teams to kind of grow out of that over time and get into a system where the WIP limit is over the whole production system, right? Because that will help you find your constraints and bottlenecks a little bit more easily than having very micromanaged WIP limits across the board. But those are the WIP control mechanisms. But now let me ask you this. You may be like, Phil, all of our columns have numbers on top of them. And yeah, it was kind of a struggle at first, but we have really focused on staying under our WIP limits, and we are. Or, you know what? We've been very careful to only pull in the minimal amount of work into the sprint backlog that we need to meet the sprint goal. We're not trying to stuff the sprint full of work, and we're doing pretty well. We're keeping our WIP limits down. We're taking a look at that. We talk about whether we have too much work in progress or not. That's good. That's all good stuff. You should all be doing those things. But let me ask you this. Are you paying attention to the rate at which work comes into your system and the rate at which work leaves your system? Are you paying attention to your arrival rate or your departure rate? Another way of asking the question, are you starting items at the same frequency that you are finishing items? You know, some teams will have WIP limits, which is a good thing, but they stuff those WIP limits as full as they can make them. So if you're a Scrum team, instead of asking yourself, what's the minimum amount of items we can pull to accomplish the sprint goal, you ask yourself, how can I fill this sprint full of work? How can I be, working on user stories for 2 weeks? Which I would argue is the wrong question. What you're doing is you're looking at those limits kind of like a recommendation, right? Like we want to hit those limits, right? We want to be working at the limit. We want to be redlined all the time. If you're a Kanban team, this kind of works the same way, whether your WIP limits are over the individual columns or whether they're over the individual system. People kind of get this idea of they have to work up to the WIP limit, right? Like, hey, if we can have 15 things going, well, our board only shows 10. Heck, we can start 5 new things. What are we doing? Sitting around on our hands. Let's go, right? Let's hit these WIP limits. Well, that's not a great way to think about WIP limits. And I would argue that one of the remedies to this way of thinking is to look at how often you are completing items, and does that line up with how often you are starting new items? Because really, if your team is working at its most sustainable pace, then you want to pull work in at the same rate that you are finishing work. You do not want to pull in work according to how much capacity you believe you have. The goal is not to maximize your capacity for work. The goal is to be delivering value at a sustainable pace. And the way we do this is we look at how often we are completing work, and then we drop our rate of pulling in new work to match that. Okay? So if you haven't been looking at that metric, if you haven't been looking at that data, start looking at it, right? Like, how often are you finishing work? So don't think about it in terms of, say, we've got a WIP limit of 4 for development and we only have 3 cards in development. Let's pull a new card. Don't think of it that way. Think of it as, have we had something leave development? If so, then maybe we're ready to pull something potentially, right? Again, I would argue that you should grow out of looking at it as a stage-by-stage thing and more of a system-wide thing. Think about it like this. Did my team deliver an item? If so, then we might be ready to start a new item. But if my team hasn't delivered an item, why should I start a new one, right? I'm starting work faster than I'm finishing it in that case. And we want to keep an eye on it to make sure that our rate of finishing and our rate of starting stay pretty close together. Now, of course, they can't always be in perfect harmony, because if they were, we could never start new work, right? Like, let's say I take a brand new team. They haven't completed anything. So they do have to start work before they finish something, right? There is a little bit of that, but we want to keep those rates as close together as possible. Finish things before you start new things. Now, why do we care about this? Well, first of all, this is an assumption that makes Little's Law work. Now, I have a previous episode on Little's Law. I think I'll probably do an episode on the different assumptions of Little's Law so that you know how Little's Law is supposed to work. I'm just going to give you the nickel definition here. And basically, Little's Law tells us that the more work we have in progress, the longer each item takes, right? There's a relationship between how much work we have in progress and how long it takes to get an item out the door, right? So the upshot is, if you want to deliver more frequently, then you want your number of items in progress to be low. In order for this relationship to work maximally, then our arrival rates and our departure rates need to be very similar. If they are way out of whack, then Little's Law gets way out of whack. And then all of a sudden, the relationship between work in progress and delivery times are not quite as clear. Things begin to travel in big batches. And about the only relationship we can say at that point is, in very broad brushstrokes, yeah, we've got so much stuff going on that everything is going to take a long time. Also, if we pay attention to matching our start rate to our finish rate, it naturally keeps work in progress constant. Because if I don't start a new thing until I finish something, right, if those things are relatively constant, then the amount of things I have in progress are going to stay relatively constant. Let's say I've got 3 things in progress. Maybe I've got a WIP limit of 5. Well, I could start something, but what if I say, no, you know what? We haven't delivered anything in a few days, so I don't feel comfortable starting something. So then we deliver something. Now our WIP is down to 2. Well, I'm going to start something. Now my WIP is back up to 3. If your arrival and departure rates are very, very close together, then your WIP is going to be very, very close. It turns out this is also an assumption that makes Little's Law work, that on average, your WIP is not really changing that much. It also helps equalize how long items stay in the system, right? Let's say that generally speaking, our cycle time, let's say 85% of our cycle time for items is 13 days. Well, if I wait till I finish something to pull something new, well, that thing that got finished, its cycle time was probably 13 days. This thing that I just pulled, how long is it probably going to be in the system? Probably 13 days, right? Because my arrival rates and departure rates are very similar, right? So the time things spend in the system is going to be very similar, right? So it helps to equalize the aging of items, which, again, is another assumption that makes Little's Law work, that the average aging of our work in progress, it basically stays as similar as we can make it throughout the course of our work. This also makes sure that if we start something, we finish it. You know, I advised an organization one time. They brought me in. I'm not going to say who it was. They're very big, especially here in Kansas City. So I'm not going to tell you who they are, but you may have received a card at some point that was made by this organization. And what they were telling me was, our developers are too slow. It takes them forever to finish something. And I'm like, okay, well, I'll come and do the gorillas in the mist thing. I'll observe them and we'll see what happens. So I joined their teams. And what I noticed is that their manager, 5 different times over a span of 2 weeks, told the team to stop what they were doing and start some other items that reflected a hot new priority. Way more work items never got done due to just shifting priorities mid-workflow than items that actually got done. It wasn't that the team was slow, it was they never had the opportunity to finish something. This organization was not paying attention to their arrival rate and their departure rate. Their arrival rate was crazy high. Their departure rate was crazy low, and they weren't asking the tough questions of what do we need to do to bring these things into equilibrium. If they did, then they might discover that the items that they started actually got finished, right? If an item entered the system, it was going to leave the system. You guessed it, this is another assumption that makes Little's Law work, that if we start items, we finish them. We finish the things that we start. Also, as we know, lowering our WIP is also going to lower our time to delivery. Man, especially if this other stuff is kicked in, then Little's Law is working in full effect. And if we are lowering the amount of items that we have in progress, then the time it takes to complete an individual item gets that much lower. And we all know this is true even just from our common everyday experience, right? If I give you one thing to focus on, what are the odds that that's going to get done in a timely manner? Pretty good, right? What if I gave you 5 things to focus on at once? How's that going to affect the one thing that I most care about? It's going to slow it down, right? Because now I've got 4 other things to worry about, right? And I'm going to be context switching, and I'm going to be getting a little progress done on each of those things instead of being focused on one thing at a time. We all know from our practical experience that having fewer things to focus on means we get them done faster, and typically we do a better job. But for some reason, that common sense thinking just gets thrown out the window when we start thinking about our development teams and their workload, right? Instead, we want to start stuff. And I know how this happens, right? Those of you that are product managers or you are IT directors and you're responsible for setting up projects and getting value delivered out of those teams, man, I get it. I know, when someone is breathing down your neck and they're telling you this project is important, this thing is super important, or, the CEO ate a Twinkie for breakfast and their blood sugar is off the charts and now they really care about this other thing. Man, I know how tempting it is to say, this is an important thing, we gotta get it started. But the thing is, if something is important, it doesn't matter when you start it. It matters when you finish it. And folks, as product managers, as IT directors, as team leads, as product owners, whatever, man, you've just got to get it into your head that if something is important, then you want to finish it as quickly and efficiently as possible. If that's true, then you need to delay starting it until the optimal time. Starting it right away is not going to help you if you've got all this other stuff in progress. It's all about when you finish. And finishing at the optimal time is highly dependent on starting at the optimal time. So the new hotness, right? The new thing that just has to get done today, delaying it may be the best thing that you ever do. If it helps bring your WIP down so that when you start that item, it just sails through production like a hot knife through butter. That's how you want your operations to work. So keeping that arrival and departure rate constant is going to help lower your time to delivery. And then, as somebody who does have to manage projects, a benefit that I really like is that matching your arrival rate to your departure rate makes your throughput a lot more consistent. In other words, the amount of things people get done per day or per week or whatever your unit of time is that you plan or measure off of, that gets a lot more consistent. It's not uncommon for teams that pay careful attention to this to all of a sudden fall into a rhythm where an item gets done every single day. Can you imagine how easy planning would be if you knew that almost all the time your team would complete an item per day? Like, wouldn't that make your planning so much easier? Wouldn't that make sprint planning so much easier? Wouldn't it make quarterly planning so much easier if you knew your team would get one thing done per day, virtually every day? Well, that's what paying attention to the arrival rate and departure rate does for you. It makes the throughput a lot more consistent, which not only helps our planning, but when we run forecasts through Monte Carlo simulations, it makes them a lot more effective because our throughput isn't in these crazy batches all over the map with lots and lots and lots of zeros in our data set followed by a 5, right? Or an 8 followed by more zeros. It's very hard to run good Monte Carlo simulations when your throughput run is all over the map. But when your throughput run is a little less erratic, and you're not always going to get exactly one item a day, sometimes it's going to be 2, sometimes it's going to be 0. But the smoother you can get it, the more effective your planning and your projections are going to be. And that is awesome. And such a simple thing to do, right? To just, before you start a new item, ask yourself, is an item leaving? Did we complete something? Is our completion rate comparable to our arrival rate? Because you want those things to be as close together as possible. Folks, here's the hard reality about knowledge work in general and software development in specific. We can actually do very little to control how long things take. Yes, we can get rid of wasteful things. We can find the kinks in the garden hose and straighten them out. We can make our operations as efficient as possible, but at the end of the day, the most efficient, waste-less team on the planet, work is still going to take as long as it takes, and there's not a lot we can do about that. But we have a lot of control over how often we decide to start something new. And that's where I would suggest you focus your attention. Look at your rate of completion and then fine-tune your rate of pulling in new work to match that. If you can get those two things lined up, I promise you, almost like magic, over time, your delivery times are going to get better and your system is going to become a lot more efficient and predictable. Thanks, everyone, for listening to Agile Bites. Agile does sometimes bite, but we don't think it always has to. If you enjoyed what you heard today, don't forget to like and subscribe to this podcast on whatever platform you happen to be using. And if you can, leave us a comment because we'd love to hear your feedback. What things would you like to hear about? What things did you hear that were valuable to you today? You can also head over to integrityinspired.com to sign up to our email list. But that's all for today, folks. We'll see you next time.